options of the National Maternity Hospital and engaging Stephen Dodds as Senior Counsel. I want to thank Maria O'Connor from the Dáil campaign, who worked hard to get the briefing together that was emailed to all TDs yesterday. And I'd like to thank Dr. Peter Boylan, all who have given their time and energy to support the motion and support the CPO of the National Maternity, or the grounds of Ellen Park. I want to welcome the fact that the Government are not opposing the motion. However, it is not clear if this means that the Government are now in favour of proceeding with a compulsory purchase order on the Ellen Park site, or are, and I strongly suspect this is the case, keeping a CPO as an option while continuing to negotiate with St Vincent's Hospital Group, or not even contemplating using the CPO. I think it is now abundantly clear that St Vincent's Healthcare Group have not moved an inch from the position they've adopted since the original proposal to co-locate the new National Maternity Hospital with St Vincent's at the Ellen Park site. Their position is very clear. They have rejected co-location and, in effect, demanded that the National Maternity Hospital be fully integrated into the St Vincent's Healthcare Group. This is what will happen if the state agrees to lease the site under conditions laid down by the St Vincent's Healthcare Group. What we are facing is a key test of the state, and we shouldn't be in any doubt about what the issues at stake are. St Vincent's Healthcare Group is a private company owned by the Religious Sisters of Charity, a Catholic religious institution. The Religious Sisters of Charity have set up a new company, St Vincent's Holdings, into which they intend transferring their shares in St Vincent's Healthcare Group. They apparently have approval from the Vatican and the Irish Bishops' Conference for this, but the transfer will only go ahead if they get their way on the National Maternity Hospital. It should be noted that under canon law, the assets of the Religious Sisters of Charity constitutes church property. It is not just a question of the state, in effect, handing over the management of a public hospital to be built at a cost likely to exceed now €1 billion and to be fully funded on a day-to-day basis by the state at a figure that have been put out of about 60 million a year to a private company. That in itself would be travesty. But there's also a question of the range of services for women which would be provided in such a scenario. The ethos of the Religious Sisters of Charity, St Vincent's Healthcare Group or St Vincent's Holding are completely clear. As I pointed out, the assets of the Religious Sisters of Charity under canon law are church property and cannot be disposed of without consent of the Vatican. It is inconceivable that the Vatican would agree to any arrangement which would allow abortion or other services forbidden by Catholic doctrine to take place in the hospital owned by a Catholic successor organisation to the Religious Sisters of Charity and built on land owned by such organisation. There is not one single hospital anywhere in the world built on Catholic-owned land which allows procedures such as elective sterilisation, IVF, genetic testing, abortion and other procedures specifically forbidden by the universal Catholic teaching. This would seriously compromise patient safety. The National Maternity Hospital is to act as a tertiary centre for complicated pregnancies. Miscarriage can occur up to 20% of pregnancies. Catholic teaching cannot be allowed to compromise the treatment of sepsis, as was the case with Savita Halappanavar. Despite repeat of the 8th Amendment and subsequent legislation, abortion services are quite limited in the state. Only 10 of the 19 maternity hospitals or units provide pregnancy termination. Only 1 in 10 GPs provide abortion services, although the numbers have reduced, women are still having to travel outside the state. One of the hospitals providing abortion is the current National Maternity Hospital at Holles Street. This would be ended if the National Maternity Hospital comes under control of the St Vincent's Healthcare Group or St Vincent's Holdings. The only way out of this mess the state finds itself in, and to achieve co-location for the National Maternity Hospital with an acute hospital, is the CPO, the Ellen Park site. The campaign group Uplift commissioned legal advice on the pros and cons of a CPO, and the advice they received from Senior Counsel Stephen Dodds was that a CPO would have an excellent chance of surviving a legal challenge to the courts. He carried out an extensive review of case law both here in Ireland and the EU alongside the constitutional issues involved. Articles 40.3.2 and 43 cover issues such as the rights of private property, the common good and the rights of religious institutions. Property rights are protected by the Constitution, but subject to the common good, provided the action proposed is appropriate and an important development in the public interest. The building of a maternity hospital to modernise and update healthcare for pregnant women is certainly in the public interest, and for the state to control such hospital and the services it will provide is also appropriate. In relation to Article 44.2.6, there is a protection for the property of religious institutions against diversion. However, this is also subject to necessary works of public utility and on payment of compensation. It is the opinion of Senior Counsel Dodds that the National Maternity Hospital would clearly constitute works of public utility in the broad sense of public use. He also believes a narrow approach to the meaning of public utility is very unlikely to be adopted by the Irish courts. A legal challenge to the CPO would obviously mean a further delay, but an appeal to the High Court must be exercised within 3 weeks of the confirmation of the order, and also an issue of such public interest is likely to be heard quickly. This issue has in any way been ongoing for almost 10 years. There's actually very little guarantee of a successful negotiation within the short term. In the minutes of the HSE board on the National Maternity Hospital on the 25th of June 2021, and I quote from it, "The issues of concern can be summarised under 3 objectives in terms of the proposed ethos of the hospital and the service it will provide, which we understand further discussions are underway. Protection of state interest in assets, ownership structure, and especially the proposed structures of the hospital." So the HSE board are seriously concerned about this. And in the HSE minutes on the 29th of October, and I quote again, "Discussion around the ownership of the site took place. The board raised concerns regarding the ultimate ownership of the site, which has been provided through long-term lease rather than by means of being sold to the state." Now, we've gone through May 2017. Deputy Simon Harris promised that we would have a legal framework in the coming month. In 2019, the then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar assured the House the details of the legal transfer would be resolved over the next couple of weeks. The current Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, gave similar assurances last year when we discussed the private members' motions, and has come out today in the newspaper in an article saying similar. This charade came to an end last year when the Deputy Varadkar finally admitted the obvious, that the deal is fundamentally, potentially, fatally flawed. Now, Minister, are we going to have to wait for another 10 years before we see a National Maternity Hospital built on public land and in public ownership? The very point that I want to make in finalising my contribution is that I call on the government to act now. It's gone on too long, and the way the Sisters of Charity are dealing with this is going to go on for a lot longer. And I call for the Minister to move to obtaining legal advice on behalf of the government and the HSE in relation to CPOing the site without any further delay. The women of Ireland deserve better. We've debated the issue over the last number of weeks. This is about our health rights, this is about our legal rights, and it must be dealt with, and it can't go on for any longer. And if we did CPO it, if the Sisters of Charity are not, pushed about this, if it's not the issue of the land ownership, they would welcome that move, and they'd negotiate with the government on it. So I think we have to move on it.
Collins, Deputy Harkin now, yes, and followed by Deputy Pringle, yes.
Thank you, Can Corla. Tonight, Minister, this House is saying for the 3rd time that the new National Maternity Hospital must be fully owned and controlled by the state, and that it rejects any agreement with St Vincent's Hospital Group or St Vincent's Holdings or the RSC, which does not achieve such state ownership and control of the facility. Now, Deputy Collins has already said that you will not oppose this motion, and I'd be pleased if that happens. However, not opposing something and taking action are two very different things. And tonight, what we're asking for is that action is taken. Last June, after the debate in this House, or around that time, I put down a written question to Minister Donnelly to ask him if the proposed National Maternity Hospital would be in public ownership. Now, in his response, he talks about planning permission, etc., but then he goes on to say, the ownership and governance arrangements are more complex. Now, that sentence alone raises all kinds of issues. He said last June they are more complex. He then goes on to talk about the Mulvey Agreement and what it does, and about the draft legal framework that's put in place. But then he finishes up by saying, I have been very clear that I will not bring anything to government unless it provides assurances around all legally permissible services being provided in the new National Maternity Hospital. And he said, in this context, as I have already stated, I intend to engage further with both St Vincent's Healthcare Group and the Religious Sisters of Charity as we move forward to the finalisation of the arrangements. Now, to me, that's the kicker. If the Minister was satisfied with the legal position, he wouldn't need any further engagement. Now, apologies for reading that detail, but it matters very much, because they're the Minister's own words. As I said, he started his answer by saying governance and ownership arrangements are more complex, and he finishes by saying he intends to have further engagement. So where precisely are we now in this process of further engagement? Have we the assurances, have we the guarantees that the Minister spoke of? Look, this has gone on for far too long, and in the final analysis, the National Maternity Hospital must be in public ownership. 100% publicly owned hospital. No ifs, no buts, and no maybes. No complex situations. This whole debate has nothing to do with any arguments about services. It's simply that the women of Ireland, the people of Ireland, must have full and unequivocal access to all legally permissible services. We shouldn't even be talking about it here. This should be an absolute given. And we're all waiting to see how this will happen. Look, I support this motion. I support the other two motions. And it's past time that we have dealt with this matter. On June 23rd, this House passed a motion calling for the new maternity hospital to be fully owned and governed by the state. And tonight, Minister, we are again delivering a very simple message. We need a publicly owned, publicly funded and publicly run National Maternity Hospital. And again, like Deputy Collins said, and while I'm glad to see you here, and I know you are listening carefully to us and fully engaged, the Minister has responsibility, the Minister for Health has responsibility for this. He should be here, because this is the third time we've had to debate this in this House. This should not be happening. We should have the clarity that we need. The Minister shouldn't be hiding behind the complexity of the situation. And I know, Minister, that you will deliver this message loud and clear to the Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Pringle.
Thank you, Cancora. I would like to thank my colleague, Deputy Joan Collins, for bringing forward this very important motion on the ownership of the National Maternity Hospital. I welcome the fact that the government will not oppose this motion calling for the compulsory purchase of the site. However, I would like to take this opportunity to strongly urge them to change their position and to CPO the National Maternity Hospital site as soon as possible. It's one thing not to oppose a motion, it's another thing to actually do something to make it a possibility. And I know, if I can say, if it was up to this minister that's here, it would be done. But I think the minister, by not being here, shows what's likely to happen. Hospitals should be state-owned and state-operated, and we have to end the constant privatisation of our services. The new National Maternity Hospital is being constructed with public money. It will be built on publicly owned land. It must be in public ownership. It is our money, and so it must be our hospital. It poses the question of why the state would invest €800 million of public money into a new National Maternity Hospital and not establish ownership. I know that this government would love to privatise all services in the country so that they would no longer be accountable for anything. But when we hand over leases to outside bodies and we let them run our essential services, we give over control on how they are run and what services are provided. We have seen time and time again the failure of private bodies to adequately provide the services we need in this country. And when it comes to healthcare, we run the risk of allowing other bodies to decide to be selective over which healthcare will be offered. This is completely unacceptable. I have very serious concerns about who the hospital will be leased to, and I am completely opposed to the suggestion of it being leased to the St Vincent Healthcare Group, or to any other religious group, or indeed any other private group as well. The possibility of the Catholic ethos overriding legislation is very concerning. I cannot stress enough that the Church has no place in women's healthcare. We have given the Catholic Church in this country far too much control for far too long, and we can no longer allow them to have a say on our healthcare or on how anything else is run in this country. This country has experienced enough pain at the hands of the Catholic Church, and such an agreement would only be a step backwards. Women in particular have suffered enough, and the Church still has much to answer for in relation to the violence they perpetrated against women of this country and the decades of hurt and shame that they have created. Despite the fact that the St Vincent's Healthcare Group have said that there will be no religious or Vatican influence, we know well that, should they be given the lease up for this hospital, they would not provide full healthcare to women. We know this because out of the many hospitals on land owned by the Church, by the Catholic Church throughout the world, there isn't a single one that provides abortion services. And the Church not only opposes the provision of abortion, but also opposes the provision of the likes of IVF and surrogacy as well. And I would like to pose the question that Dr. Peter Boylan, the former master of the maternity hospital, posed. Give me just one example anywhere in the world of a hospital built on Catholic-owned land that provides abortions, IVF and gender reassignment surgery and other procedures absolutely prohibited worldwide by the Church's universal healthcare directives. 4 years after posing that question, Dr. Boylan is still waiting for an answer. And why? Because no such hospital exists. To not provide these services would deny women the full and safe access to healthcare that they are entitled to in this country. No religious ethos must be allowed to interfere in the medical decisions made by our doctors and by women on their own bodies. This country decided that those days were well over when we voted to repeal the 8th in 2018. And I urge the government not to pull us back to a time when women did not have those reproductive rights. We still have a very long way to go when it comes to women's healthcare in this country. And we still continue to fail women every single day. We need to be taking further steps to ensure that women's healthcare is prioritised and not overlooked. We cannot afford to let things continue the way that they are now, and we most certainly cannot allow ourselves to take any backward steps. Catholic misogyny and religious control no longer has a place in this country, and we cannot allow it to have any future place in this country either. Only full public ownership and full public governance can guarantee a full service of reproductive health care. I cannot stress enough that the new maternity hospital must be public and it must be secular, and that's what this motion intends to deliver. Thank you.
Minister, please.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle, and I want to thank the deputies for raising this important issue this evening regarding the National Maternity Hospital. I think it's important to put on the record, I'm taking it on behalf of Minister Donnelly, who is currently meeting with NEFIT, is what I'm told. And the government will not be opposing today's motion. I think it's fair to say that every member in this House shares the same goals, that is the delivery of the best possible healthcare for women and babies. This government has set out its stall in that regard by committing to improving women's healthcare across the board.
This year, building on funding provided in 2021, we're providing significant investment in the services and continuing our focus to implement the National Maternity Strategy. The National Maternity Strategy sets out a vision for future maternity services where women are treated with dignity and respect in an appropriate physical environment. Linked to this point, the practice of having standalone maternity hospitals, as is the case in 4 of our maternity services, does not reflect best international practice. Ensuring that mothers and babies have access to the full range of medical and support services should the need arise is of paramount importance. It is widely accepted that the best way to achieve this is to co-locate maternity services with adult and acute services. That is why this government's policy, as reiterated in the National Maternity Strategy, to co-locate the remaining standalone maternity hospitals with adult acute hospitals. It is acknowledged that the buildings at Holles Street are no longer fit for purpose. The new maternity hospital is planned to be the first of our 4 remaining standalone maternity hospitals to be co-located. The new hospital is a vital piece of infrastructure and one that will help underpin the development of maternity services and the implementation of the National Maternity Strategy into the future. As has been stated by the Minister for Health on numerous occasions, the Government is committed to the development of a new National Maternity Hospital as is set out in the programme for government. That being said, the Government is also very aware of concerns voiced in relation to the new hospital. As set out in the motion we are discussing here today, those concerns centre on the ownership and clinical independence of the new hospital, and today's motion reflects that is in calling for a compulsory purchase order of the site for the new hospital. When it comes to the new National Maternity Hospital, however so achieved, we all ultimately want the same outcome, and that is to ensure that all legally permissible services are provided in the new hospital. This is an absolute requirement. We must also ensure that the state's significant investment in the facility is protected. The Government understands the concerns regarding ownership and governance and recognises that they must be addressed. And it is important to note that significant work has been undertaken in this regard. This includes the appointment of Kieran Mulvey by the Minister for Health in 2016 to intercede between the hospitals. The resulting Mulvey agreement was finalised following an extensive mediation process between the National Maternity Hospital and the St Vincent's Health Care Group. The agreement was subsequently published and noted by Government in 2017. The Mulvey Agreement provides for the establishment of a new company which will have clinical and operational as well as financial and budgetary independence in the provision of health services. Following on from the Mulvey Agreement, a draft legal framework has been developed which aims to copper fasten these arrangements. In doing so, the legal framework will also address states' core objectives, which are to ensure that, firstly, all clinical appropriate services that are legally permissible and are provided for women who need them in the new National Maternity Hospital. Secondly, to prevent any undue influence, religious or otherwise, in the operation of the new hospital. Thirdly, to protect the state's investment in relation to the capital revenue and service provision of the new hospital for the public good. In relation to the draft legal framework, as I understand it, there has been further engagement with stakeholders, and this process will continue as we work towards the finalisation of these legal arrangements. However, as the Minister for Health has previously said, he will not be making any further comment on the nature of the engagements until it concludes. However, what I can say definitely is that the Minister for Health has been very clear that he will not be bringing any proposal to Government in relation to the new National Maternity Hospital unless it provides assurances around all legal permissible services being provided in the new hospital, as well as affirming that the state's investment is safeguarded. Concerns continue to circulate in relation to the potential involvement of the Religious Sisters of Charity in the new National Maternity Hospital. As such, the Minister for Health wishes to make it absolutely and unambiguously clear that the Sisters will not play any role in the governance or operation of the new National Maternity Hospital. I am advised that the sisters have resigned from the St Vincent Hospital Group Board, and their shareholding is to be transferred to a new charitable entity, St Vincent's Holdings CLG, under the terms of their legal service agreement. St Vincent's Healthcare Group requires the consent of the HSE to share transfer. This consent has been sought by the St Vincent Health Group, and it is anticipated that the matter will be addressed in the context of the finalisation of the draft legal framework. In closing, let me restate that we all want the very best of care for women and babies of this country, and we want to see them treated in the best possible environments. The planned move of the National Maternity Hospital to the Ellen Park campus is a key part of achieving that aim and providing the state-of-the-art facilities that women not only need but deserve. Therefore, I would ask all members of the House to support government in its continued commitment to women's health and progressing the necessary relocation of the National Maternity Hospital to appropriate physical environment as envisaged in the National Maternity Strategy. This government's commitment to the new National Maternity Hospital falls very much in line with our broader commitment to delivering better health outcomes for women of Ireland. As demonstrated in the last two budgets, we are investing significant funding in women's health services to ensure that improvements are made and outcomes for people using the services are enhanced. This commitment is reflected within Budget 2022, for example, in the allocation of 31 million for the new development funding to specifically support women's health. This includes significant investment to further progress the implementation of the National Maternity Strategy, gynaecology service development, as well as a further 5 million for a dedicated women's health fund. To conclude, and in keeping with the government's focus on women's health, we must redouble our efforts to bring the National Maternity Hospital project to the next phase, but with all the necessary assurances in relation to the services to be provided for women. Doing so will help us to provide the necessary infrastructure and environment to realise our common goal: woman-centred, modern, safe, quality healthcare for women and their families that is delivered with compassion, dignity and respect.
Thank you very much, Minister. Deputy Catherine Connolly.
Corla, there comes a point where words fail me, Minister, and you're in an extremely difficult position. Let me say openly, it is totally unacceptable that Minister Donnelly is not here, that you have had to read out this speech, which is an insult to the women of Ireland, and I go that strong in relation to what I'm reading, that somebody would write a speech and a minister would read out that I would ask all members of the House to support the government in its continued commitment to women's health. Women's health. I will try to remain calm in relation to this. This is the third motion in 7 months. The government has accepted each motion. I'm not sure if the government is able to read or able to understand what these motions are asking for, maybe in different, somewhat nuanced way, that the new National Maternity Hospital is publicly owned, publicly operated on a site owned by the state. Crystal clear. If you agreed to that, then we need a speech that's dealing with that. And again, Minister, I don't personalise it. I've seen you work extremely hard along with your colleague, Mary Butler, and I've paid tribute to you on well, in this case, to read out this speech, there comes a point in a minister's life where you say, this is simply not acceptable. So our third motion, we have a choice here. It might be better if each of us stood in silence for 10 minutes, and when Sinn Féin do it, and it might be a more effective way to get through to the government in relation to the democratic process. Because all of the Dáil unanimously is saying, owned the National Maternity Hospital, owned the site. Now, for a minister not to show tonight, and for a speech like that to be written in a week where we are focused on the tragic and unacceptable death of Aisling Murphy, and in that context to have statements in here on how unequal women have been treated in our society. And each and every deputy has spoken, and I want to stay away from politicising. It was in the context of the debate here in relation to inequality. And no later than today, we had the legislation in relation to access to records, and once again, the finally, slowly, and still not emerging from the patriarchy. from the 52 Adoption Act that was closed and secretive to beginning to open up, to a National Maternity Hospital that's on the cards since 2008 with a KPMG report, a 2013 announcement by Minister O'Reilly of the co-location. For a civil servant or somebody to write that and give us a lecture on the importance of co-location is insulting and unacceptable. This decision of co-location was accepted by everyone, all governments and all TDs from 2013 onwards. What is not accepted are the Byzantine, Kafkaesque arrangements going on behind the scenes in relation to religious ethos. The nuns might be gone, but those doing their, believing in their philosophy, and Mary Aikenhead, and fair play to them. I have no problem with that, as long as it's not being imposed on a public hospital. That's the difficulty. And so we go forward from 2013, when Minister O'Reilly announced it. And over that period up to today, we've had all sorts of suggestions, including that the nuns were gifting it to the people of Ireland, some gift. And then we had a 99-year lease, a 999-year lease, a 99-year lease, and now a 299-year lease. We talk about operating licenses. We talk about St. Vincent's holding, the group, the health group, the holding group, the DRC. Byzantine doesn't cover it. So I'm going to try and stick with a simple message, Minister, because I know where your heart is, but I'd like to know where your views are in relation to this, and who's actually going to stand up and make language mean something. A National Maternity Hospital has to be owned by the state for the men and women of Ireland and future generations, full stop. There is no going back on that. We've had 4 male ministers, and that's fine, except we have different messages from each of them in turn. We've had Minister Harris, can't remember what Minister O'Reilly said. Minister Harris said that we would have a public hospital on a site that was leased. Minister Varadkar, who was Minister for Health at the time, said we would have a public hospital on a public site. And then instead of going forward on that, we then have Minister Donnelly, who can't be here tonight, tell us he's given us reassurances. I don't want reassurances as a female TD. I'm sure my colleagues that are male don't want reassurances. We want a public hospital on public land. And if we go back to the gift from the nuns, let's make that a reality, shall we? Make it a reality. I'm looking at this period of time in women's lives, and I'm looking at the parallel efforts and deaths and suffering that led to the National Maternity Strategy that's now been boasted about here. The National Maternity Strategy came 100 years after the 1916 proclamation, and it was forced on the deaths and suffering of women. Portlaoise, Portiuncula, Civita, Halapanavar in my own city. Report after report highlighting the inadequacy of the maternity services throughout the country, notwithstanding the wonderful staff. Let's not do this. I'm not giving out about staff. I'm giving out about lack of resources, lack of commitment, and services run on a charity basis. And we look at all of that. What have we achieved? That we're here getting reassurances, that we're here, that out there while we're in here, another secret deal is going to be negotiated. Notwithstanding the overwhelming demand from people in Ireland, as demonstrated by the people who protested in Dublin, by the constant representations that we get, by the fantastic work from Dr. Boylan, Marie O'Connor, and many, many others, and Uplift, who paid and organised a senior council's opinion. Not a reference to it in this speech from whoever wrote it. I'd love to know, did the minister write it? And if he did, I'd like him to be in here to stand over it. What is the answer to the see, of course it's an opinion, and you can get other opinions, but I'd like to hear, did the department get other opinions in relation to this? Uplift commission this on our behalf. And they point out in relation to CPO that there are possible obstacles, but that they can be overcome, and at the end of the day, really they come down on the side of no obstacle. And it is quite possible under the Constitution to CPO the land if necessary. The only thing that I've ever heard from the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, in relation to this is that it would delay the project unnecessarily. Well, I stand here tonight and I ask all the other TDs here to confirm that we don't mind a delay. We don't want a delay. A delay is unacceptable. But if that is the strongest reason that the Taoiseach can come up with for not compulsory purchasing the site, then that's totally unacceptable. And I would say a CPO puts it up to the entities that are out there, and they're worthy of a mystery novel, really, at this stage, the amount of entities that are out there in relation to a public national maternity hospital. CPO is not necessary if they agree. Absolutely not necessary. And all we want is for the government of the day to listen to the overwhelming voices of people here in the Dáil on behalf of the people of Ireland who say enough is enough. We've said it in other contexts this week. We've said it in terms of gender violence and domestic violence. We've said it in terms of fundamental right for access to records without hurdles, without various steps from a patriarchal society or a management that think they know best. Minister, you know enough is enough. A National Maternity Hospital. I'm going to finish by saying the Maternity Strategy 2016 is more than halfway through. We only got an implementation plan published just before Christmas, consequent on pressure within the Dáil for motion that I put and other people put in relation to the implementation of the strategy. So when we stand and talk about a strategy, one has to say, how is it being implemented? HEQA did a report in 2020 on it. They said it was slow progress or no progress, patchy progress. And they didn't know who they were reporting to. Nobody knew who they were reporting to. This is the strategy that we're crowing about in this speech. So, conjura a curle macupla focal, tá magohan agam, tá she haram bart yenov de rare armriher, agus brie a horch the okal, agus the chorus dain las.
Deputy Cullinan, you're sharing with colleagues.
10 minutes and the remainder with my colleagues, as I would imagine would have been outlined. Can I first of all start by commending the proposers of the motion and thanking them for again giving us the opportunity for the third occasion in this chamber to discuss and debate this important issue. In fact, I've debated this issue and discussed it with the Minister for Health at the Joint Oireachtas Committee on a number of occasions. I had private conversations with him by telephone, and we had discussions and debates in the Dáil chamber as well. And I have to concur with Deputy Connolly that it is completely unacceptable that the Minister is not here. Now, I will always give fair due to a Minister because there may be a reason that the Minister is not here, or good reason. But it seems from listening to what the Minister for State has read out, his rationale for not being here is because he is still involved in discussions in relation to this issue, and I don't think that's an acceptable excuse not to be here. The question of ownership of the National Maternity Hospital, in my view, is very important, and it does matter, and it is vital that we get it right, and for that reason, of course, I'll be supporting this motion. There is no justification, in my view, for leaving the ownership and the governance structures in the hands of a private company when the state is making the investment and will be paying the bills. And I have to say, I would imagine that many people, and many women especially, who will be listening into this debate, and I would hope a majority of men as well, will be saying this is again a case of déjà vu in terms of how the state sees women, in terms of how the state values women, in terms of how the state treats women, and the lens through which the state and the public healthcare system sees women's healthcare. Because for me, there can be no justification for the state building a maternity hospital that is not owned by the state, but also where we have a convoluted governance structure in relation to that hospital. And when there are serious questions being asked by many people in relation to potential interference in healthcare and women's healthcare in maternity services. And I think these are deeply held and legitimate concerns that are being raised by many people. I have two primary concerns about the current proposal for ownership of the site, Minister. Firstly, it is my view that the state's investment must be absolutely safeguarded. This is going to cost hundreds of millions of euro. And it's not radical, in my view, to ask that the state would own the hospital once it's built. I think it's reckless to proceed with building a hospital and the state not owning the land at the end of that process. So far from this being a radical proposal by members of the opposition, it's actually sensible, and it's about safeguarding the investment of the taxpayer. But perhaps, and I would say without doubt, the more significant concern is the potential for interference in the running of the hospital. And there's good reasons for that. And that's because of the history of this state when it comes to how it treats women and women's healthcare. And I don't have to remind the Minister of the many, many failings and the many, many issues, even in more recent times, where women were failed in the Irish healthcare system. So to avoid any potential complications which could arise for any number of reasons, I believe, Minister, that the full ownership of the site in the state's interest, by the state, is in the best interests of women and the people of this state. This is a principle, in my view, which must underpin public expenditure on major capital projects, particularly in healthcare, where organisations with a religious ethos are involved. Now, as I said, I've discussed this issue privately with the Minister before, and I and members of my party have raised it a number of times in the Dáil and at meetings at Oireachtas committees. Indeed, Teachta O'Reilly would have raised this at a time when the Minister for Health indeed was in opposition and was raising very, very similar concerns that members of this opposition are now raising. And again, it seems to me that the Minister for Health is taking a different position now when in government and as a minister to a position that he very strongly articulated when he was an opposition health spokesperson. Over the last few months, and again this evening through the written script delivered by the Minister of State in the Chamber, the Minister for Health has given us some assurances, he would say, or as he would see it, regarding protections against any interference in the management and the running of the new National Maternity Hospital. But it has to be said, those assurances are simply not good enough, and many people simply don't believe them. I do not need to remind the Minister, and indeed the Minister for State, about the importance of ensuring that there is no religious interference in the running of any maternity hospital, and for all the obvious reasons for that. The guarantees that the Minister have given us, in my view, are not sufficient for us to back him. And I won't be, as the previous speaker has said, given support to the government in relation to their approach to this unless I see a fundamental shift. The fact of the matter is that there are fundamental issues with the proposed arrangements, and it has to be said that this mess dates back to a number of years. It dates back to when the former Minister, Dr. James Riley, was the Minister for Health. It dates back to when the Taoiseach was a Minister for Health. It dates back to when Deputy Harris was a Minister for Health. And yet the controversy has trundled on unresolved, and it has to be said this is a mess of Fine Gael's making. And in my view, they have to take ownership for it. So for me, this issue comes down to two simple facts. The taxpayer is paying for it, and I have yet to be convinced that there's absolutely no potential for healthcare services which are entirely legal in this state to be curtailed on non-medical grounds. I do not doubt for 1 minute the ability of clinicians in St Vincent's or indeed in Holles Street, and their determination to deliver the high quality services that their patients need. And I've listened to many in those hospitals, and I've read newspaper articles and indeed letters to the editor, letters that have been submitted to national newspapers as well by people who work in those hospitals, and they themselves also setting out assurances. I also do not doubt the effectiveness of the voluntary public hospital model from the St Vincent's and Holles Street to the St James's or Children's Health Ireland, because I think this governance model has served us well. And in fact, I would argue, Minister, that it should be a model that would be used to roll out regional health areas because of the accountable autonomy nature of voluntary hospitals. So I don't doubt the sincerity of the people who work in the system. And I don't doubt the sincerity of those who work in any of the maternity hospitals. But their ability to deliver top-class healthcare is not what concerns me. Of course, I have every confidence that they can deliver the best healthcare. It is the behind-the-scenes politics which could infringe on women's healthcare and the rights of women and the future of maternity services that concerns me. Last time we had this debate was shortly after St Vincent's Healthcare Group said that the land could not be gifted or sold to the state because it would disrupt integrated patient care on the site. I don't buy that, I didn't buy it then, and I still don't buy it. There are similar arrangements in place in the Mater and the Rotunda, for example, where they have a relationship, 2 different hospitals on 2 different sites, so it can be done. And again, I'm looking at the written speech that was given by the Minister where she says that concerns continue to circulate in relation to the potential involvement of the Religious Sisters of Charity in the new National Maternity Hospital. It goes on to say, as such, the Minister for Health wishes to make it absolutely and unambiguously clear that the sisters will not play any role in the governance or operation of our new National Maternity Hospital. It talks about the sisters resigning from the board and then transferring a shareholding to a new charitable entity, St Vincent's Holdings CLG. Now, with all due respect, Minister, why are the Sisters of Charity going down such a convoluted road? If they are genuine and if they are sincere about relinquishing all control, then why not simply gift the land to the state? And then there would be no issue. There would be no need to CPO. There would be no need to set up this convoluted structure where there is a distant relationship between the management of that hospital and the HSE and the state, and indeed it would resolve the ownership issues. And that's why there is suspicion. That's why there is suspicion, because it doesn't make sense when you have on the one hand the Sisters of Charity saying, hands off, we won't have any role, we don't want to have any say, we're essentially gifting the land to the state, but we're going to do it through this convoluted process of setting up this charitable group and not as most reasonable people would see it or would want to see it, the land being gifted to the state. So I'm afraid I'm not convinced at all by anything I've heard from the Minister. The last time we debated these issues at the Oireachtas Health Committee, in any private conversations I've had with him, and indeed in this chamber. And I think it's really regrettable in a week where, again, tragically, women's rights, women's healthcare, the safety of women and all of those issues were tragically brought into sharp focus, that the Minister is not here to take this debate. I think that's regrettable given the seriousness of the issue.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Louise O'Reilly.
Ceann Corla, and there are, I suppose, probably 2 reasons why I wanted to make a small contribution to this debate. One is to say I absolutely accept that we need a new maternity hospital. We needed one in 1995 when my daughter was born in Holles Street. Indeed, I well recall being wheeled back from the labour ward and the bed was still warm because the person in front of me had literally only just vacated it. So we needed one in 1995. My grandson also born in Holles Street. We certainly needed one in 2015. So I absolutely accept that we need a new national maternity hospital. We all do, and we want it built. We understand co-location, with the greatest of respect, and having it explained to us probably wouldn't be necessary. We get co-location, we understand why it's important. But the main reason I wanted to speak this evening is to recall Sheila Hodgers. Sheila died in 1983. She died in a hospital that was run by an organisation known as the Medical Missionaries of Mary. And she died and her baby died. And we can debate this all day, but I will tell you with my hand on my heart, it was the ethos in that hospital that contributed very significantly to her death in her 20s and the death of her baby. She died in agony. She'd been denied pain relief for fear that it would in some way, shape or form harm a pregnancy that was not viable. And her husband, Brendan, who I know well, he's a former colleague of my dad's, recalls going to see her in the hospital and her screaming in agony and could not get pain relief. Okay, so I know what it was that caused that. And Minister, you know as well. And I mean, I'll echo what was said here. It is regrettable that the Minister for Health is not here. I think it speaks volumes to anyone who wants to listen, and I do not mean that in a disrespectful way to you, and I thank you for being here, Minister, and for your words. And I fully respect that the script you were given is the one that you have read out, but you will also understand that those words are going to be of very, very cold comfort to anyone who remembers Sheila Hodges. Go on, Megan.
It's a bit difficult to follow on from Deputy O'Reilly if we talk about somebody that died at the hands of that. But anyhow, I'd like to thank Deputies Collins and Pringle for bringing forward this motion. It's not the first time we have debated this topic, and I do hope it will be the last, Minister. I too am aware that you're sitting here instead of Minister Donnelly. The National Maternity Hospital is yet another hospital building project that is grossly overspent. The construction costs are currently estimated at €800 million, with the original estimate in 2013 being €300 million. It's now heading for 3 times the original expected cost. Minister, I'm not a naive person. I understand that materials are rising and all of that, but that's absolutely ridiculous. We must insist that the new maternity hospital is fully owned and controlled by the state and reject any agreement which does not achieve such state ownership and control of the facility. It is necessary that the government must acquire the Ellen Park site through a compulsory purchase order by the HSE with the approval of the Minister for Health. There are very real concerns in relation to the ownership of the site as well as that of the hospital governance. I think everybody would accept that we don't want to see any outside influence or interference in the running of any hospital, but especially not the National Maternity Hospital. Excuse me. The best option here would be for the Religious Sisters of Charity to give the land to the state. They are saying this is essentially what is being done with the establishment of an independent private charity. And Deputy Cullinan spoke on that also. We need to see how the new National Maternity Hospital built as quickly as possible. It is already 7 years behind schedule. It would be better to have a public hospital built on public land and governed by the state. But this government, unfortunately, doesn't do planning very well. The government must engage extensively with the Religious Sisters of Charity and the St Vincent Hospital Care Group to find a solution. Minister, all options must be on the table. Garth Magut.
There seems to be an endless saga around the National Maternity Hospital as it continues its long-involved journey to completion. It has been beset by a series of incidents from its very conception almost 10 years ago when it was planned to relocate the hospital from its current location in the Hollow Street campus to a new site. The story of the National Maternity Hospital is one that tells of a project long in the planning but beset by delays, complications and justified concerns over its governance and ownership, which has stalled progress on the project for years. Experienced mediators have been brought in to try and find a way through the muddle and put the project on a clear path to completion. Adding to the concerns over the governance, arrangements at the hospital have been the eye-watering escalation in the costs of its construction. The project was originally to have costed in the region of 150 million. The cost of the building infrastructure is now being put at 500 million, with an added cost of a further 300 million for commissioning costs, which are to include the fit-out and transferring the hospital to a new site. All told, the cost of the hospital has gone from its original target of 150 to 800 million. The site is to be transferred to a charitable entity called St Vincent's Holdings. This has raised concerns over the potential for a Catholic ethos governing the hospital, which could inhibit the new hospital from carrying out procedures which are contrary to Catholic teaching. It is reasonable to argue that to protect and maintain the hospital's secular ethos, that it should be owned by the state. The government needs to protect its investments, and it must be able to justify the expenditure of such enormous sums of public money in this major project by ensuring that the hospital's administration, operation and oversight reflects both the values and the inclusiveness of a state secular body. To do any less could potentially lead to unfair and prejudicial treatment of people, as well as creating a hierarchy of patients. We cannot allow this to happen, and we cannot allow one viewpoint based on a religious ethos to supersede that of a secular state. And the government must ensure that this never happens. Thank you.
I'd like to commend the independent group here for tabling this motion before the Dáil. The ownership and the governance of the new National Maternity Hospital is an issue of real national importance. It is also of great local interest to the community here in Dublin Bay South. For decades, the National Maternity Hospital has been based on Holles Street in the heart of inner city Dublin. The local community have an enormous sense of connection to the maternity hospital in Holles Street. Many in the community took the first breath in that hospital, and I was one of them. And a large amount of people from the community either work there or have many family working there. And from talking to these people, I've heard first-hand accounts of the difficulties staff are facing. It's a really tight spot and tight site, and they're trying to run a big operation, and there's an urgent need for a new, a more modern building to give staff and mothers the supports they need. The new National Maternity Hospital will be based not far from Holles Street on the Ellen Park campus of St Vincent's Hospital. This new National Maternity Hospital will be a costly investment for the state, and it will see the provision of state-of-the-art equipment and a modernised building that is much needed. However, this process cannot be rushed through. We need to ensure that this large-scale state investment is protected from outside interference, and the best safeguard of all is to ensure the full public ownership of this new maternity hospital. There are many people who are deeply concerned over potential interference of religious orders at this new maternity hospital. Concerns that the governance and ethos of St Vincent's could limit the procedures of the new site due to the religious ethos are understandable. Safeguards must be put in place to ensure that the patients can freely access the treatments they require. The possibility that organisations separate to the state may interfere to prevent certain treatments cannot be allowed. The state must guarantee that any lawful service which the hospital is expected to provide is not restricted on any non-medical grounds. And the best guarantee of all is full public ownership on the new National Maternity Hospital.
Thank you, Deputy Duncan Smith.
To commend Deputy Collins and Deputy Pringle and the independent group for moving this motion. I'd just like to start by saying this whole practice of the government not opposing motions is starting to wear a little thin because they're not opposing the motion because they agree with it. Sometimes a motion will come to the House which the government won't oppose, and it's understandable because it could be a motherhood and apple pie motion. But when it's a motion like this, which is actually calling for something specific, and it's very clear that the government do not support that in terms of the CPOing of the land and are not going down that road, then by not saying that, by not putting it to a vote and voting against it, as is their position, then it's a dishonest way of putting forward the government's position. And it really has to stop. And maybe they want to save their backbenchers, a difficult weekend or longer in their constituencies. Maybe it's the screenshot culture of the voting screens going onto social media. Maybe that's something we all need to take responsibility for in terms of how we practice our politics. But it's not right when it comes to a motion such as this. because you don't support this motion, you don't agree with it, you didn't agree with the Social Democrats' motion on it, you didn't agree with Sinn Féin's motion on it, you didn't agree with Alan Kelly when he raised it in Leaders' Questions, you didn't agree with Deputy Ivana Bacik when she raised it as her first, one of her first contributions in the Dáil when she took a Leaders' Question and the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar responded. You don't agree with it. So say that and stand over, be honest with the people and give the Parliament the respect it deserves on an issue of such importance. And just to go back to last summer, it was June when there was an all-party motion agreed on this. Again, the government agreed, allowing it to go through. And the Taoiseach in his response to Deputy Bacik said, well, look, we need to move ahead with this. There'll be delays with a CPO. A CPO process isn't a guarantee either. And sure, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. I mean, sometimes the good isn't good enough. And that's what we have here. No one has convinced anyone in this House, including people on the government benches, that the new National Maternity Hospital will be free from religious ethos. Whether it be in the termination of pregnancies, assisted human reproduction, IVF treatment, there's been no guarantees given. We can't even get guarantees that there won't be religious iconography on the walls, as there currently is in the National Maternity Hospital, not a couple of hundred yards from where we are now. So this is not an idle motion. It's the exact opposite. This has been going on for 10 years, but specifically for the last 5 years since Minister Harris was Minister for Health, when this has really become a live issue and decisions have to be made. And it's been clear that the government are going down the path of least resistance, and they're taking a gamble at a time when we're 4 years on from repealing the 8th Amendment, and we still have women who are having to travel. We have an assisted human reproductive bill which is going nowhere. We had a general scheme published nearly 5 years ago now. We had a draft bill apparently somewhere in the department for the last 3 years, but we have not had it brought to this House. And there are people all over this country waiting for that bill. People dealing with surrogacy, gay couples. We have widows with the gametes of their deceased partner is all they have left in the freezers of private fertility clinics, waiting for guiding legislation on what can be done with it. These are day in, day out, harrowing stories for people waiting for legislation in relation to women's health. And it's all interlinked to this. And it's almost crystallised in this debate for the National Maternity Hospital. So it's really annoying that when it's brought again and again, like in an even-tempered, intelligent manner, as is this motion, as have been the previous motions, as have been previous contributions, that the government, who I believe that there is a critical mass within government who actually know that this is the right thing to do, but they're not doing it. They're going with the good in terms of the perfect, and they're taking a massive risk. And quite simply, the very basic ask of having a state-owned, state-run national maternity hospital in 21st century Ireland, that we can't guarantee that, is a sad indictment of how far we still have to go. This debate would not be happening in any democracy, any of our sister democracies in Europe at the moment. We would not be having this once, never mind multiple times over the last number of years. Even the clinicians who are in favour of the move to Elm Park are doing so, again, knowing that they can't provide the guarantees. But they're practicalists, they're pragmatists, they're maybe non-political, they just want to get on with it, but they know that they can't provide those guarantees. They know it, they've said it to us. So there is this sense of the unknown, this sense of risk, and there doesn't have to be. We can follow what this motion calls for, what other motions call for, what the opposition have called for, consistently, intelligently, passionately, but calmly, that we would go down a CPO process. And if it does delay it, then, well, that would be disappointing and will be difficult. Ultimately, we will get a national maternity hospital that is suited to this country, where the majority of people in this country are now, in terms of their politics, in terms of women's healthcare, and in terms of what they need and what they desire for the years ahead. Thank you.
David Shortall.
At the outset, I just want to commend Deputies Collins and Pringle in bringing this motion forward. I think it's a very good motion, and it's very timely, because we've been waiting many, many years for movement on a new national maternity hospital. This was first announced in 2013, and there have been 3 ministers for health since then. And issues started to arise in 2016. And I don't know, I've lost count of the number of PQs I've had down. I've lost count of the number of Dáil debates that have taken place on this. And every time a PQ is put in and we ask, what's the up-to-date position, what's happening in relation to the proposed new hospital, we're told that legal documents are being finalised and they will be completed shortly. And that's been the reply really for about 5 or 6 years. So, you know, the government got itself onto a hook when it decided that it was going to co-locate the new National Maternity Hospital with St. Vincent's. And they did that not taking into any account the question of ethos, and a hospital that is controlled essentially, and many of us would argue owned by a religious order. Obviously there's going to be a major problem in relation to ethos and curtailment of services that are available, services that are under the law available in this country but unlikely to be available in a religious hospital. There's no Catholic hospital in the world that provides the full range of women's healthcare services. So there's no reason to think that Ireland is going to break the mould on that. It just won't happen. And that's the reality of the thing. So that's the first concern. And like, you have to ask, why on earth in the year 2022, given all of the difficulties in the past where responsibility was outsourced to the religious for schools, for care facilities, for healthcare, and all of the attendant difficulties associated with that, and the fact that the state funded all of these services and facilities and has no way now of taking ownership of them. So given all of those problems, given all of the problems associated with that kind of control that the religious too often exercised over women and children in this country, why in heaven's name would the government think about a national maternity hospital of all types of hospitals to fund and hand over then to effectively religious control? I mean, it's just outrageous when you think about it. Like, the government's own commissioned report, the Catherine Day report, which was looking at all of these issues related to Section 38, Section 39s, and, as I say, the handover of vast amounts of public infrastructure to religious orders. And her findings in that, where, you know, state-funded facilities should, of course, be in state ownership. And that was only kind of in the last couple of years that the Catherine Day report came out. So you're ignoring your own commissioned report. And there is no doubt that if this arrangement, as is currently proposed by government, goes ahead, there will be severe restrictions on the services that are available to women. We know even though this is denied, we know that up to the last year or so, and may well be still the case, we know there are plenty of examples of where St. Vincent's Healthcare Group have advertised for staff, and there is a requirement to follow the religious ethos of the owners of that hospital. That's the first point, and I really think that the government and successive ministers have been in complete denial about this. And there's a lot of new information that is coming to light in recent times, and Mary O'Connor in particular has done extensive work in relation to this, where, you know, it's quite clear that the Constitution, the operating values are intended to be based on the original values and the ethos of the religious sisters that have been running St. Vincent's for so long. So that's the first thing, and I think that's beyond kind of argument that would be the case. Just on the principle of it, like, why would the state fund a hospital to the tune of 800 million euro and hand it over to a religious organisation? I mean, there's no kind of logical justification on any ground for that. The other thing is that, of course, from the taxpayer's perspective, why would the state invest in a major piece of public infrastructure in the shape of a national maternity hospital, plough 800 million euro into that and hand it away to private interests, give it away? I mean, why would you do that? I mean, that shows a complete disregard for the need to protect the public purse. So why are we repeating the mistakes of the past? It doesn't make any sense on any grounds. And look, I just want to say, again, you know, it seems that either the minister doesn't understand the corporate structure that is proposed, that this will entail, or else he's just choosing to ignore it. But the corporate structure is about St. Vincent's, which is wholly owned by the Religious Sisters of Charity, that it's wholly owned by them at the moment. They are proposing to transfer their shareholding into a holding company, and that holding company, which doesn't exist as of yet, by the way, we were told a number of years ago that this move was happening, but that holding company doesn't exist as of yet. But the proposal is that holding company would then own the new National Maternity Hospital, own the company, the National Maternity Hospital DAC. So we'd have a situation where the ground on which the new hospital is to be built would be owned by St. Vincent's Holding Company, where the company operating the hospital would be a wholly owned subsidiary of the St. Vincent's Holding Company. So it would transfer in its entirety, it would appear, to the ownership of St. Vincent's Holding Company. Like, this just doesn't make sense on any level whatsoever. The other thing I just want to say is that there is a requirement, of course, for a business case, in fact 3 business cases, under the Public Spending Code. Those business cases haven't been prepared yet. There is a difficulty in preparing them because this does not stack up financially. And the HSE's own Audit and Risk Committee have turned this proposal down on 6 different occasions. This proposal stinks on a number of fronts. It cannot be proceeded with. It would be a dereliction of duty of this government, both in ethical terms and in financial probity terms. It cannot go ahead. Thank you.
10 years ago, Savita Halappanavar died in an Irish hospital. 4 years ago, the Irish people voted overwhelmingly for change. But the government seemed to be very, very slow to get the message. Half of our maternity hospitals still do not provide abortion services. Just 1 in 10 GPs provide abortion services. But the situation with this proposed new National Maternity Hospital takes the biscuit. I'd like to ask the Minister if the press reports that we've read are true. Is the government seriously considering allowing 3 directors onto the board of our National Maternity Hospital from St. Vincent's, a proxy organisation for the Religious Sisters of Charity? Is the government seriously considering allowing the site to remain in the ownership of this proxy organisation? Is the government aware of any country, anywhere in the world, where a Roman Catholic religious institution has allowed abortions, in vitro fertilisation, or sterilisations take place in a hospital sited on their lands. It is as though the government, Count Corla, have learned nothing. It is as though the government has paid no attention to the changes that have taken place in our society, including those taking place before our very eyes this week. I believe we need a people power campaign on the National Maternity Hospital issue, because no faith can be placed in the government, given your track record on this issue in recent months and years. I will be supporting this motion. I favour compulsory acquisition of the land, nationalisation of the land, rather than a lucrative compulsory purchase order. But the motion is clear on the issue of the need for 100% state ownership, and on that basis, I will be supporting it.
And in closing, I'd like to thank the deputies for tabling their motion today, and I fully recognise the importance of both government and opposition alike thoroughly scrutinising the issues under consideration. The level of interest in the development of the new National Maternity Hospital is a clear reflection that everyone right across politics and across our health service share the same goal when it comes to the revision of maternity and women's health care. As stated earlier, the goal is best summed up through the vision of the National Maternity Strategy, that women and babies have access to safe, high-quality care in a setting that is most appropriate to their needs, that women and families are placed at the centre of all services and are treated with dignity, respect and compassion, and that parents are supported before, during and after pregnancy to allow them to give their child the best possible start in life. In the context of that shared vision, I would like to reiterate that this government remains fully committed to the development of maternity and women's health services in this country. In that regard, we are bringing greater focus on women's health, and we are investing more than ever before to ensure that the progress achieved in women's health is consolidated and expanded for all women and girls into the future. The relocation of the National Maternity Hospital is also a very significant part of the government's objectives in this regard. We remain committed to providing the highest quality infrastructure and environment to facilitate the delivery of a modern, safe, quality maternity service for women and infants for many years to come. It should be noted that clinicians at the National Maternity Hospital have publicly expressed their support for the move, including a letter to the Irish Times last June. These are the people on the front line delivering babies and supporting women, and who understand how important and necessary this new facility is. It is recognised that the buildings at Holles Street are no longer fit for purpose, which underlines the importance of moving forward and bringing the new National Maternity Hospital to facilitate the delivery of maternity and related services that are in keeping with the vision of the National Maternity Strategy. In the context of discussions on the National Maternity Hospital project, queries have been raised regarding the state's investment and the estimated cost of the new hospital. Various figures have been referenced over the years since this move was first announced in 2013. However, it should be noted that the Public Spending Code is designed to ensure that investment decisions are underpinned by a clear policy rationale and that costs are well understood. As such, all capital development proposals, including the National Maternity Hospital project, must progress through several approval stages in line with the life cycle approach to the Public Spending Code, including detailed appraisal, planning, design and procurement before a firm timeline or funding requirement can be established and approved by the government. Therefore, it would be premature for me to discuss potential costs for this project at this juncture. Yes, the planned move of the National Maternity Hospital is a complex project, and yes, very valid concerns have been raised across a number of areas. However, I'd like the deputies here today to know that many of those concerns were identified at an early stage and have been the subject of significant and protracted discussions over several years. In particular, the issues of governance, which have been raised here today, and clinical independence have been at the core of those discussions. That is why so much time and effort has gone into developing the draft legal framework with the aim of providing the assurances we need in relation to the hospital's ability to provide the full range of women's health services in accordance with the laws and policies of the state. To conclude, the very bottom line is that the new hospital must and will provide the full spectrum of services without any undue influence that would put women's reproductive health care at risk or endanger any woman's safety. That, as the Minister for Health has stated strongly, is a red line issue for him and for this government. Indeed, the Minister has been very clear that he will not bring any proposal to government unless it provides assurances around all legally permissible services being provided in the new National Maternity Hospital, as they are in the current hospital building. In addition, the safeguarding of the state's investment must also be put beyond doubt. In that context, there has been further engagement with stakeholders, and the process will continue as we work towards the finalisation of these legal arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Collins, to conclude, please.
Thanks, Joan Collins. It looks like we've been deserted tonight in relation to the debate. First of all, I want to concur with Deputy Connolly in the response the Minister gave us. I think it's an insult, and it's not just an insult to me, it's an insult to women in this country. First of all, may I say that I believe the Mulvey Agreement in setting up a legal entity, a legal framework, has actually spurred the religious sisters of charity to continue on the vein that they have continued on. It was co-location, now it's changed to full integration. That's what the Sisters of Charity and their holding groups are looking for. We can see that the bugbear is still there. On the minutes of the 29th of October 2021, the HSE board meeting, the board raised concerns regarding the ultimate ownership of the site, which has been provided through long-term lease rather than by means of being sold to the state. Now, that discussion is going to go nowhere, because if the Sisters of Charity and their lawyers are not going to agree to that, we're going to be here forever and a day. And the Minister will never be able to bring a proposal to government that's going to be clearly saying that the hospital and the land will be in government control, state control and ownership. The reply as well, I think, is a bit insulting. We have always in this House supported the government in relation to the National Maternity Hospital. What we're saying is that it's protracted now. It's gone on too long. And how long more do we have to wait for to agree with legal discussions that are going nowhere? Because the HSE are saying they will not deal with it unless, according to their words, by means of being sold to the state. They're saying that that needs to be done. And the lawyers and Sisters of Charity are saying, no, we are gifting the land to our SVHG, the St. Vincent's Healthcare Group. Now, either be honest and say that you don't support that, or do. Because not once in the Minister's reply have I seen that he is in favour, or the government are in favour, of public ownership and public land on St. Vincent's Hospital. They talk about clinical needs and all that, but they don't actually say it, even though the government have supported 2 motions previously on this. I think this is the words of Peter Boylan, Dr. Peter Boylan, who resigned from the Dáil Street Board. The ownership of the land on which the hospital is to be built is the key issue from which all matters relating to clinical independence from inappropriate religious ethos, protection of the state's investment and appropriate governance flow. The project is stalled because the sisters are refusing to sell the land to the state, even though they said they'd gift it to the state, or the Irish people, I think they put it. And in the absence of ownership of the land, no amount of legal negotiations over years on leases and licences, etc., have been able to provide the state with security on these issues. That's the reality. It's going nowhere unless this is resolved. And furthermore, Peter Boylan says, as you will see in the attached summary, the board of the HSE has expressed grave concerns about the project, and the Controller and Auditor General is currently conducting an audit of the project. We have a new development that paves the way forward for the National Maternity Hospital in a way that will resolve all concerns. The groundbreaking legal opinion commissioned by Uplift and published by Stephen Dodd, Senior Counsel, has concluded that the state could present a compelling case to meet the test to justify a compulsory purchase order on the Elland Park site. Mr. Dodd's legal opinion is that as the hospital being built is a national maternity facility which has been wholly funded by the state has an interest in ownership that substantially outweighs that of the Religious Sisters of Charity and St Vincent's Healthcare Group. Mr. Dodd's opinion cuts through the current impasse. He has scrutinised the current proposals and has described them as Byzantine and Kafkaesque. His legal opinion is that the fact that there's a set of labyrinth arrangements have to be devised where the construction and implications of the same are contentious and doubtful is highly unsatisfactory. Considering the importance of the National Maternity Hospital and vast monies being expended by the state, there would seem to be a significant public interest in certainty in relationship to these matters. And he concludes, arguably, the matter is of such importance to the state that there is legitimate state interest in achieving certainty which could only be secured by the state having full control through ownership of the relevant land and assets. Now, again, I'm asking the question where we're going on this. If the state gets the legal briefing in relation to the Department of Health and the Minister in relation to CPO and the site, the sisters would have to agree to it. And if they don't, it'll go into court, obviously, in relation to CPO. But I think then we'd see whether the Sisters of Charity are really being genuine on what they're saying. We need that land. The state needs the land. The women of this country needs that land. Because what you don't own, you don't control. It's as simple as that. And if we're still going through the process of legal discussions and legal whatever, the fact of the matter is the land won't be handed over to us unless we demand it. And I'm saying to the Minister and to yourself and the government backbenchers to go to the Minister and argue strongly that we must move to CPO that land. We have, over the last century, had the mother and babies homes, mainly women, treated abysmally. We've had symphysiotomy. We've had the practice of it. And we've had the cervical cancer screen crisis and what that's happened to women. We've had a detailed discussion on how we've lived in this patriarchal society over the last number of years, and yet when it comes to one of the most basic things that we need is a publicly owned, publicly controlled hospital, National Maternity Hospital. We're seeing this call for, what was it? I'd ask the members of the House to support the government in its continued commitment to women's health and progressing the necessary relocation. You know, that's patronising, to be quite honest. And I'm going to end by just saying that the state must move on this, because we can't wait another year, another 2 years, another 3 years. And by moving now to a CPO, we would at least be seeing that we can actually get to the beginning of building a maternity hospital on that site that's in our control and the state's control. So thanks very much, Joan Collins, for chairing the debate. I'm bitterly disappointed with the response, bitterly disappointed the minister isn't here. And we will keep on, and not just me or anybody in this Dáil chamber, but people out in the streets are going to demand this. So I put you on warning that people won't accept this long-term thing. And I understand that the doctors and nurses in the Holles Street want to move out of there. It's a building that's ancient, difficult to work in, etc. And they want to move to a modern National Maternity Hospital. But it has to be that hospital then works under the legal demands of the state. So I'll leave it at that, Joan Collins.
Deputy Collins, is it agreed now that the motion as proposed by Deputy Collins be agreed to? Motion is agreed. Thank you all very much for that. The sin tá ganón na seacht in a taga condera or céad seacht in a céad seacht in haar national show. Agus tá $1 atlo go dtí an mórte cúin se sin an fé cúig ó lá de anar ag a dó clog.